So welcome, those of us who are joining us on Zoom, those of us who are watching via Facebook, and of course, those of us who are watching on YouTube as well. This is episode 4 of the Bright Green Debates, and it's absolutely wonderful for you to be watching this evening. What an odd phrasing. I've got a few bits of housekeeping to get started with before we start the event proper. So firstly, my name is Chris, and I'm going to be hosting a discussion on the Bright Green Debates this evening. So for those of you who are new to the Bright Green Debates is essentially a new show hosted by Bright Green, which is an online publication focused on progressive analysis of social movements, of the Labour movement, of the UK's Green parties, and of culture and the arts. And we're bringing together on these debates, people from across progressive movements, across the left, from trade unions, from the media, from musicians, artists, MPs, and so on, to have conversations about the biggest issues of the day and help to inform debate and discussion on the left. Few bits more housekeeping before we get going. So firstly, for those of you who are joining via Zoom, please do keep your mics off. Firstly, it will just mean that we have as little disturbance as possible on the debate, but it also means that you won't accidentally appear randomly on the stream and get broadcast to the world via Facebook and YouTube. And if you don't want your face on the internet, then probably best keep your mic off. The last bits and pieces of admin is just to say, if you're watching on Facebook, please do right now share the video stream. The more people we have sharing the stream, the more people that see it. So if you've enjoyed these debates so far, if you're enjoying tonight's debate, then other people you know will enjoy it too. So please do share it. Please do like the stream, comment below what your thoughts are, and get more people watching. And of course, if you're watching back on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you click the little bell to get notifications. Share the video as always, and comment to tell us what you think below. So I think that's all of the kind of housekeeping admin. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our incredible panel for this evening. So I'm really excited by this panel, and I'm sure you will be too. We have Olivia Blake. Olivia, do you want to give a wave? There's a wave from Olivia. Olivia is the Labour MP for Sheffield Hallam. She's a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs. Rosie Rawle. Rosie, do you want to give a wave? So Rosie is currently the co-chair of the Young Greens of England and Wales. We have Billy Hayes with us. Billy, give us a wave. Billy is a former General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union. We have Deborah Hermanns. Deborah, give us a wave. Deborah is on the National Coordinating Group for Momentum. We have Chris TT. Chris, give us a wave. Great wave, double hand wave there. Chris is a writer and a musician. And finally, we have Sarah Walpole. Sarah, give us a wave. So Sarah is a campaigner with Keep Our NHS Public. So that's our wonderful panel. We're running a little bit late to start, so I'm going to dive straight into our questions for this evening. So we've had a whole host of questions submitted in advance of this, and we're going to try and get through 4 of them. And the first of these is, well, I'm going to put it straightforwardly, but it's not a straightforward question. The question is, how do we save the arts sector post-COVID? And I'm going to come to Chris first on this question.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here. I tend to think of the Music Venue Trust, which is a small charity fighting to save grassroots music venues, as the clearest and most useful voice on this. And so probably the things I would suggest would be along a lot of the same lines as what they're already campaigning for. I've got kind of 3 things that are like right at the top of my head for ways to save particularly the live arts, but the whole kind of arts sector, and bring them back to somewhere healthy after COVID. The first one is obvious, and it sort of applies far more widely than just the arts sector, which would be universal, quite comfortable income and universal, quite comfortable services, which is something that a lot of people in progressive politics are like looking at, and it's beginning to be legitimised and made more mainstream. And I find it, I notice I avoided the word basic, now I've said it, but we need to, in the long term, consciously uncouple the idea of working for your basic livelihood and make those two things separate, partly because jobs are going to be fewer right across the board, but partly because life is much nicer without that, and still all the useful stuff gets done. But anyway, the three things I was going to suggest are universal, quite comfortable income, campaigning for that, looking for ways to run trials and run little stress tests of how that works would be a brilliant thing. The second thing would be one of the biggest problems, which was identified by the Music Venues Trust even before COVID, is how many of our arts and cultural providers are tenants rather than owners of their space, and how few of the buildings that the arts take place in are either publicly owned by the state or owned by the people actually invested in doing the art making themselves. We've got a diabolical landlord problem where an extraordinary high amount of the money that goes into, comes out of the punter's pocket and goes into whether they're going to a gig or an art exhibition or a piece of theatre. It's just an extraordinary proportion of that money never really goes into the building in the first place, because the moment it goes over the front desk in ticket sales or over the bar in alcohol sales, it goes straight into the pockets of landlords who aren't in no way invested in the art sector. They just happen to be the landlords of buildings. So if we could work to change that so that a higher proportion of people curating and making arts, whether that's gigs or whether that's art or whether that's theatre, any kind of discipline, had security of their property. Now, either that's, this is the sort of forum where it'd be okay to talk about nationalising big arts buildings and ownership of the, state ownership and council owned art spaces. That's great, but the other way for that would be that have small grassroots arts venues find a way where they can own their own space, or they can be guaranteed that they're staying there whatever happens for the long term. One of the big problems with COVID, of course, was that when the ticket sales went out the window, it was okay for some because they could furlough their staff, but they couldn't stop paying their rent, and that's where people have struggled. And then the final one would be just to prioritise the unsexy stuff in the arts. So that's the small scale, participatory, community. Participation is a massive part of it. If we could focus on that stuff in communities at a local level, rather than the big splashy, sexy arts, the great big institutions that we all know and loathe or love, then we can build something back that will be for everybody and be really interesting. I just think if we've got this as an unpleasant starting point, we absolutely need to focus on people, not on buildings, and not on also the nebulous idea of great art. Nobody in the Arts Council or nobody in any of our great public arts institutions knows what the hell great art is, really. They're all just guessing at it. And so if you focus on participation, focus on people, focus on people's livelihoods, and get rid of the landlords, then hopefully that would be that's my menu for fixing things.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Before I bring in our next panelist, I just wanted to apologise to those of you who joined late because of technical difficulties. There appears to have been a problem with the auto email on Eventbrite. If you do know anyone who's trying to get in via the link and can't, please do send them to our Facebook page where we're broadcasting live as well, facebook.com/brightgrn, and they can join via that link as well. Apologies again. So I'm going to come to Rosie next on this one. So Rosie, how do we save the art sector post-COVID?
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, thanks for having me as well. And I would echo an awful lot of what Chris was saying there. I liked the sound of that menu and was also going to make the argument around, for a start, a universal basic income, or a basic income to at least allow people to afford a decent living through this crisis. And the wild thing about this is that these calls were happening 12 months ago, when it was so obvious that the art sector was going to feel like it was going to be hit hard by the pandemic. Like the Musicians Union was calling for it, artists and performers were calling for it, and we saw an opportunity there. And there have been, as Chris was saying, these kind of pushes for basic income trials. But that would still be helpful now, and there is a chance to bring that in, and that would not only support people in the arts sector, of course, but also support people in so many industries that have been left behind by the furlough scheme, and the support made available by the government during this time. And then the second thing I was also going to say was around Arts Council funding and keeping these venues, these grassroots community buildings alive. Generally, we know how often it is that, or how rarely it is that when you see a community venue close down, that another one pops up in its place. Like, councils don't have the funding to scrape together to build that space once again. And so I think that one of the main things that we have to see moving, like, post-COVID, is keeping those venues open no matter what, and like not letting them close down, even if it has to mean like just trying to keep them open for a number of days at a time. The return to things as normal is going to be phased, and like in that phasing, the arts sector is going to still feel that cost. So I think that we really have to be planning for that period, as well as just the idea that like things will switch back on again. But I guess generally, throughout all of this, I think that we need to be making the argument that the arts sector obviously shouldn't be measured on its impact, like, for the economy, whilst that is like significant in itself, but like the cultural and philosophical basis and value of the arts sector has no price tag, and it has no value. And the aim here shouldn't be, the aim in the arts shouldn't be about creating profit, and it should be about giving everyone a sense of meaning and self. And it'll probably be something that helps a lot of us through this crisis if it hasn't already. And that's not the view of the Tories, of course, but I think it is the argument that we are going to have to make at every step of this fight, and it's an argument that we have to win. So I think that kind of pieces those things together. But that's it from me.
Thank you, Rosie. So I think I could see a hand there from Sarah, but I'm going to actually bring Olivia in next, if that's okay, and then I'll come to you shortly. So Olivia, one of the things that's been discussed there as a approach to saving the arts post-COVID and also during the COVID crisis is a universal basic income. Is that something that you'd support as part of a package to support the arts sector?
Well, I mean, personally, I've supported trialling UBI for a long time, and when I was actually, before I became an MP, I was deputy leader and cabinet member for finance at the local council, and we passed a motion to try and get a trial. And you may have seen around the time that John McDonnell actually said Sheffield would be a great place to do a pilot. So I've long been involved with trying to get something like UBI, partly because I was very much afraid of some big disaster. I wasn't necessarily thinking of a pandemic. I was more focused on the climate and or just the general reduction in jobs as being kind of that pressure point where we need to have these answers. So I think it's really worth investigating and kind of trialling these. And I think actually we had the perfect opportunity to do that in the pandemic, and unfortunately the government did not take it up. I mean, in terms of other things that I think are necessary, previously I've been a trustee of a museum, and I think that it's so important that we make sure that you know, our collections that belong to our cities in a lot of cases are as accessible as possible. And I think that there has actually been some great moves to do some of that, and I think, you know, creatives are such innovators, and I think there's been some really exciting stuff, and I think that should just continue, and we need to continue to make the case to broaden access to the arts and to make them more successful as we get out of this. I think not-for-profits have particularly been hit really hard, and I've, you know, personally as an MP, I've met with local creatives and theatres groups in the city and heard firsthand from them how difficult it is, and the risk actually to kind of the equality streams of funding that they want to see protected, so that, you know, those feminist groups, those Black actor groups can make the great art that we want to see, and I think that for me has to be at its core. And I know that Rosie said you can't put a number on it, but I'm going to, because it's not a small drop in the ocean. It's 111 billion of the UK's economy before COVID was creative industries, and obviously that takes in such a wide range of different jobs and skills and exciting things that people have been doing for a long time. So I really feel that government can't forget the arts, and we've got to remember that more often than not, these jobs are green jobs, and they should be forming a bigger part of our kind of jobs in the future.
Thank you, Olivia. I just wanted to say another quick apology for those of you who are joining us on Zoom late as a result of the technical difficulties. Those now appear to have been fixed and people are coming in. But if you do know anyone who's still struggling to get into the call, please do send them to our Facebook page and they can watch the live stream there. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, please do share the link. We have over 20 people watching on Facebook. Let's get that higher. I reckon we can hit 100 tonight. We can only do it by you sharing that link. So if you're enjoying this discussion, other people you know will enjoy it too. So share that link. I'm going to bring in Sarah next on this one. So Sarah, how do we save the arts sector post-COVID?
I think to save the arts sector, we need to value it, as others have said. And really, it's not just about us saving the arts sector. I think the arts sector is going to really help to save us and allow us to do more than just survive this pandemic, but to thrive. I think Rosie started to pick up some points about the different kinds of value that the arts sector will bring for us, about improving well-being, promoting creativity, the massive mental health toll that we're going to see as a result of this pandemic will not be addressed if we do not support the arts as one way for people to access emotions, to enrich their lives in different ways. I think really it's been really exciting to see the arts sector evolving during the pandemic, and the increased accessibility of lots of different kinds of arts, from visual arts to online access to art galleries to gigs, and I think there's we've learned a lot of really positive things, so we need to support the art sector financially, but also in terms of our engagement. One of the challenges, I think, is that for those who were established in the arts sector, things may not have been as bad. There's been ways to adapt. For people who want to go into the arts, it's a difficult world right now. And so I think, as well as requiring a universal, quite comfortable income, we also need to think about students coming out of their training with large amounts of debt and then feeling unable to go into work in the arts. And that will be one of the other ways that we kind of make it more accessible for people to work within the arts sector as well. So I think, most importantly, we just need to remember how the arts enriches our lives and is an essential part of our society.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to bring Deborah in next. And again, we've had a lot about universal basic income. We hear a lot about universal basic income on a lot of these debates. Is that something you'd support as part of a package to save the arts?
I think it is definitely one. I think it's definitely one policy that we should push for, alongside universal basic services. I think we need both of those, not just one or the other. And definitely, I would agree with a lot of what's been said by the other speakers. I guess the only thing I would just sort of add is that I think fundamentally we cannot return to the status quo. Saving the arts cannot be about returning to the status quo, because that is not working for the majority of workers in the arts sector. When you have, thousands, hundreds of thousands of precariously employed people, from artists to front of house workers, barely sort of earning minimum wage or more, on the one hand, and then you have artistic directors at the National Theatre, the South Bank, taking home six-figure salaries and continuing to do so. That is just not working, and it's something we absolutely have to change. And it isn't just COVID that has sort of created this situation, but also the politics of austerity, of budget cuts over the past 10, 15 years. We absolutely have to sort of reverse these shifts. And I think the number one thing we have to do is to empower people, empower workers in the sector, basically, in order to save it. And I think it was really sort of heartening and inspiring to see last summer, the various struggles, PCS strikers at the Tate, and also South Bank workers. And you could see, yeah, I remember in London, like going to some protests where there was sort of really inspiring solidarity between workers at various arts institutions, sort of coming together to not just fight for their jobs, but also to sort of save the sector as a whole, and sort of show solidarity with each other. And I think that's extremely important and is what we should be supporting. And I just want to end on something. I asked a friend today who sort of, very, very active organising within the arts. And she sent me this statement from the PCS cultural group that they put out in October alongside various other sort of unions from across Europe. And I found it genuinely like a really inspiring call to arms. And I was going to post it maybe in the chat if that's okay. And there was just this one line that I found particularly inspiring that I thought I'd read out, which said, "Together, we must reaffirm that culture is neither merchandise nor sold surcharge, but is essential to link up, share and build a just free world, united and happy, and it is essential to the social transformation of society and democracy," which I think sort of, gets absolutely to the point of what some of the previous speakers have said.
Thank you, Deborah. So finally on this one, Billy, so obviously one of the biggest questions when we're talking about saving the arts is one of the biggest questions is about how do we protect workers in the arts, both performers, but also every other worker that is involved in the arts sector. So with your background as a trade unionist, Billy, how do you think that we should save the arts post-COVID?
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And I'm conscious also that we're able to do this because of the work that CWU members did and do continue to do in laying the cables. And it was the CWU in the early 90s actually called for superfast broadband. So there's a kind of a linkage. But as it happens, my relatives work in the film and TV industry. And one of my cousins is a producer in the TV industry, and she's a single parent. And she said to me, she went from giving food to food banks to taking food from food banks, to support a child. I mean, so, I've got some connections there in terms of what's going on in the industry. Similarly, my other cousin, who's the sound mixer, quite an Oscar winner once, dare I say it, said when they were trying to renegotiate the big agreements for the television industry, he told me how well the industry's doing. TV, it's in a bit of a golden age, the TV and film industry. And I think one of the things we need to focus on, first of all, that just focusing on the electronic media, as it were, at the moment. It's a successful part of the British economy, a very successful part. And you can Google and look at the number of film productions that are going to take place in the UK in the next year. Big productions. And by and large, it's still fairly well unionized. And, some people get phenomenal salaries, but that's not everybody. But one of the things that's infected the film and TV industry is casualization. And that's, much more in terms, we call it the gig economy, but that's all it really is casualization of the industry. And I'm reminded of something Brian Eno said about the arts not so long ago. Brian Eno, the musician and artist, he said he wouldn't have been able to do what he does now had it not been for the welfare state when he was growing up. That is kind of and I don't know how many people are familiar with Brian Eno's work, but really good stuff. So there's that aspect of the, people have real problems, and that's been multiplied and exacerbated by the COVID crisis. But I would say we need to obviously look to support them. But it's a tiny bit like the football industry or the soccer industry. The big companies, your MGM and Warner Brothers, are making phenomenal amounts of money. And there should be some kind of scheme where they need to support, because what they do, like, for example, David Morrissey wouldn't be the David Morrissey is today had it not been for the Everyman Youth Theatre that was subsidised. And that's true of Bill Knighty, although not youth theatre, but, theatres in Liverpool, and, where I came from, I'm not there now. But those kind of things, seeing them institutions as worthy of support, and there is a bit of a bias against art in general in this particularly in government, particularly with this government, that somehow arts, one group goes before the other, and arts is always quite low down. But we need to remember the art industry is phenomenally sick. British art, in the general sense, there's many different strands and sectors, is phenomenally successful. But what infects it, and it was touched on by Deborah there, is this casualization of the work that we live under now, so-called gig economy. So make the big people, the people that make the big money, contribute to the people at the, I hate using the term chain, but people are lower down the chain with support for local theatre. And I think also all this talk about coming out of COVID, and I'll finish on this, I think there's going to be once we eventually come out of the lockdown proper, there's going to be an explosion, because so many people have put in their diaries, I will see my Auntie Dora, or I'll meet my friend I haven't seen for 9 million years. And there'll be so much of that, people just wanting to go out, and the arts will play a part of that. So we need to say the arts is a particular successful sector, and we need to support it, and we need to nurture emerging talent. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy, for that. So I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there's anyone who wants to come back in on anything. And while I do, I just wanted to give another push. If you're watching live on Facebook, please do share the link. It means more people will be watching, more people will hear from our excellent panel. If you are enjoying this, they will enjoy this too. One thing I haven't yet mentioned is you can tweet along all of the debate on the hashtag Bright Green Debates and join the conversation there. I think I saw a hand from Olivia, so I'm going to bring Olivia back in quickly, and then I'll move on to our next question.
I was just going to say, the other thing that we haven't discussed or touched on is Brexit and the huge impact that's going to have on touring artists, and that's something that needs sorting urgently, so that, especially younger artists are able to get around Europe as quickly as possible, to get back on the scene and really see that element of our kind of culture be reciprocal as well, because I think there's a real risk there otherwise.
Thanks, Olivia. So I'm going to move us on to our second question, because we've got a lot to get through and we started a little late. So our second question rather is in response to what we've seen over the last sort of 10 days or so now, the kind of public response to the police bill, with regards to the protests that we've seen, obviously in Bristol, have taken a lot of the headlines, but also elsewhere in Manchester, in London, in Brighton, across the country, we've seen people standing up against the government's police bill. So the question we have tonight is, will the resistance we're seeing to that be enough to stop the bill? And I'm going to bring in Olivia first on this one.
I think that is the key question, really. And I think we have to say, we've already had kind of one win with this. They were going to rush that bill through Parliament as quickly as they possibly could to limit the opposition that could build against it. So, it is because of organisations like Sisters Uncut and others who have been, raising the profile of this bill, doing fantastic work to get people more knowledgeable. I've had so many emails about it, and, that's a really good sign, on many different aspects of the bill. And I was lucky enough to get selected to speak in the first debate that we had in Parliament on it. And, the points I kind of made there was, this is a really nasty piece of legislation, and the whole kind of premise is that it will make us safer, and I honestly don't feel any safer looking at that bill and seeing how much more restricted our freedoms would be under it. I consider myself a nuisance, and I don't see that as a bad thing. Because of the views I hold, I will always champion them, and I don't think that should be a reasonable excuse to police a protest. I think that we shouldn't be targeting peaceful protest at all. The point that you get charged more for tearing down a statue than you would for a rape offence is quite honestly heartbreaking, and I can see why so many people are angry. And I think around Sarah Everard's death and others, all those women who have lost their lives at the hands of men in what I think is quite gendered violence. You know, I think people should be angry and have a right to be angry about the way things are going. I think that, you know, over the last 10 years, we've seen attacks on our basic rights to organise, to express ourselves. You know, we had the gagging bill all those years ago. We had the new restrictions on trade unions that, you know, have really limited the ability. Does this mean now if we protest alongside those 4 illegal pickets, that will be breaking this law? You know, these are the issues, and I think that we have to wake up. This is a really, really terrifying moment in our history. These sorts of powers don't come about at a time where politics is going in the right direction. These are the politics of fear. They're the politics of state against the people, and we have to ask the question why. Because, you know, we've got some of the biggest challenges that our world has ever seen coming down the track very quickly, and I think that we all just need to kind of lift our heads and work above our differences to help stop this. So hopefully, if everyone gets involved and does everything they can, we can get the government to change their mind. Unfortunately, I don't trust this government further than I can throw them, but I'll continue to do whatever I can in Parliament to oppose, and I just ask that everybody else joins with us to do that.
Thank you, Olivia. So over to you next, Billy. Do you think the fight back we're seeing against the police bill will be enough to defeat it? I think you're on mute there, Billy.
The straight answer is, I don't honestly know, but what I do know, activity is always better than passivity. You know, I often quote, when I was General Secretary, in Mandelson's book, not that I've read every page of it, but in page, 148 or something like that, he accused the CWU of getting up to every political trick in the book to defeat him when he tried to privatise Royal Mail. And I used to always say on public platforms, I plead guilty as charged, because that's what we did. We done everything and we won with the support of the Parliamentary Labour Party. This government can be beaten. There's no question about that. You know, they're a government that's got 56.2% of the seats on 43.6% of the vote. So they can be beaten, but we have to obviously think through our tactics and keep the pressure up. So they can be beaten. And one of my kind of experience of being involved in fights, if you like, if I can put it as sharp as that, is that you have to fight so, you know, almost quoting what's his name, Napoleon, audacity. If you're prepared to fight, they will start to waver. This is a government that was defeated by a young footballer over school meals. We should be able to push back on this because it's such an affront to democracy. I thought the whole point of protest was to be annoying. You know, that's the whole point, isn't it? Isn't the whole point is to be controversial, to be upsetting and all the rest of it. And what you get with we've almost got a state media now. What you get is a state-sponsored media, as it were. You know, you've got to be prepared to fight and not let the kind of the brickbats and the kind of attacks. Look, the Mail, the Express, and all the right-wing media are going to attack us whatever we do. Doesn't matter what we do. Then, you know, the Daily Mail Mail editorial says, "Oh well, you've raised a fairly decent point. I think we should back down." That's not going to happen. We have to look. You know, this is a real affront on democracy, and I wouldn't rule out, making alliance with some people to the right of us because it's such a generalised assault on democracy. And the thing about, the thing about the statues, you get 10 years for destroying a statue and you get 5 years for rape. I mean, it's just so unbelievable as not to be believed. You know, almost it feels unbelievable. So I think we can win. You know, I've always believed that. You know, optimism of the will, maybe pessimism of the intellect. But also, you never know until you engage, and there's every chance of this government being pushed back on that, because they're high on the polls at the moment, but they can be defeated, and yes, we can defeat this bill, but the whole point about struggle, there's no guarantees in struggle. First you must engage the enemy and then see what happens. And I'm optimistic that we can push back on some of the most pernicious. When I seen a former chief constable of Manchester asking for the bill to be put to one side, I thought they're on the back foot here. I mean, it's a bit of a difficult prize to win, but I think Priti Patel has probably got the prize as the worst home secretary. I mean, tough competition, I have to say, but she's probably the worst home secretary in my lifetime, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy, for that. I think I saw a hand from Deborah, so I'm going to bring Deborah in on this question next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really enjoyed listening to you there, Billy, and a very inspiring call to arms. And I think Olivia also set it out quite well at the beginning in terms of the sort of historical context, I guess, in which this bill is. And yeah, I 100% agree with Billy. If you're going into a fight, you have to fight to win, right? You're not going into a fight in order to lose it. And I think 100%, if we're able to build a movement-wide coalition that stretches across different sections of society, that sort of uses all tools possible to sort of protest, all tools out of dispersal, then the Tories can be beaten on this. I don't think they will change their mind, but I think ultimately what they're interested in is the polls, their image, and they know that there are many, many more fights ahead for them in the next few years. There's many things that they want to sort of implement. So I think it is possible to beat them, but also we need to be realistic that they have an 80-seat majority. And I think if we are able to put up like a really strong opposition, as has already happened, and continue that and build that over the next few months, and ultimately we're not able to defeat the bill either in full or at all, we shouldn't be disheartened by that either, because I think the connections that we can be making over these next few months are essential. The coalition that's already started to build, I think it's extremely important, sort of crossing the lines of racial justice, women's rights, class struggle, environmental justice. I was at the protest, the vigil in Clapham, and then literally I think there was like 4 days in a row of protests in London, and I felt old. I was honestly, I felt like one of the oldest people there, and I'm 28. And it was really, really inspiring seeing people there. And I haven't sort of stopped looking at the Twitter feed and what's happening in Bristol. And I think they're out in the street again tonight. And the final thing I will say is that I think it is also important that the coalitions we build, we use that to sort of build up our confidence to not comply with any bill that does pass. If this bill passes and the government effectively makes it illegal to organise any protests, organisations from social movements to the labour movement, all trade unions, all of us, we must say that we will not abide by those rules. We will continue protesting anyway. And I think that sort of confidence can only be built through struggle over the next few months.
Thank you, Deborah. So I'm going to come to Rosie next. So just to reflect on some of the points that have already been made. So obviously we've had an acknowledgement of the Tories' 80-seat majority, but also some clear examples of instances where the government has been defeated on free school meals and so on. So do you think that the resistance to the police bill will be enough to defeat it?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with so many of the points that have been made by all of the speakers. I think this has been a really valuable discussion. And as so many people have been saying, it does feel like an issue where you almost can't imagine not winning, and you feel like we have almost no choice to win, because this bill will do so much harm to so many of the progressive movements that are yet to come. So many of the campaigns, it is so cross-cutting for all of us that we feel that there is no choice. And as Billy was saying as well, we have fought attacks on our right to protest before. We have fought attacks on our democracy before. And the movements that Deborah is talking about, these broad build, using every tool that we have in the book, broad broad movement building, and building that base, I think, is going to be vital. Taking to the streets, causing the annoyance, causing the disruption, causing basically a crisis in the status quo where it is impossible for the Tories to back down. But I agree, maybe not agree with us, but at least back down, I think is the way that we'll see this through. And we are seeing that in Manchester, we're seeing that in Bristol, and we're seeing these protests in London. I think we need to continue that rolling. And I think also over the course of those protests as well, of course, we've seen how bad the existing laws already are. And I think actually public opinion will be with us and is generally turning to understand that like a police force that like is visibly literally drunk on power should not be given anymore. And I think there's like lots of wider questions here about how we think about policing, an opportunity to reconsider what public safety actually means. And are there other services that also provide protection to the public? Increased housing services, from domestic abuse services to, there are lots of other ways to ensure public safety, rather than just inflating policing, police funding as well. So I think there's an opportunity here to start rethinking how we envision public safety. And I think that I'd agree with Deborah. I think no matter what happens, like we must ensure that we don't comply with the bill if it passes. But I think it can be defeated, especially with, I think, the turn of the public that we're seeing at the moment.
Thanks, Rosie. So over to Sarah now. So Rosie finished there by saying this bill can be defeated. Do you think it can, Sarah?
This really is kind of hopefully the pinnacle of an assault on democracy, it feels like, because we've had a year of backhand deals of things happening outside of the radar of the public eye and public scrutiny. And now we have this bill being put forward, which actively prevents us from engaging on matters that are relevant to society and being able to democratically put our views forward. Extinction Rebellion has really been an interesting force and changed the way that people protest, I think. And I think that's been, obviously it's not well received by everyone, but I think overall that's been really positive and has showed that we're kind of reaching a critical time where we just need to go to other tactics. And then we've had COVID, which has of course meant that lots of people can't go out and demonstrate and protest in the ways that they might have done. And I do think it's concerning that a bill's being put forward that is pushing people to go out in the numbers that they're going out at a time when we should be social distancing, albeit outside. And I absolutely don't blame the people who are doing that. But I think it's the positive side of that is that people have been campaigning on this and many other issues in very creative ways, sometimes from home, collaborating in different ways as well. So I completely agree that whatever the outcome of this, we must continue to be able to express our kind of views and protest on important issues as they go forward, and that we need to continue, to do the sort of work that Bright Green is doing, and to try to ensure that there's media that represents more than just a kind of very narrow spectrum of views that we're seeing. Whether we can do it, I completely agree with Billy. That is an important question, but regardless of whether we can do it, we have to campaign on this all out. So Keep Our NHS Public has recently been one of a few different organisations that's been campaigning around the trade bill, which didn't receive much coverage in the media at all. Trade has not been a sexy topic. It's not been something people have been wanting to cover in the media, but it's crucially important to our public services and to many aspects of our life, like labour standards, environmental standards. So we were campaigning alongside other organisations to try and ensure that there was scrutiny of trade deals that come up in future. And I'm sure Olivia was among those Labour MPs who voted for scrutiny of future trade deals. And of course, the Lords said that there should be scrutiny. MPs should be able to view the terms of negotiation of trade deals, should be able to vote on the outcome of trade deals. And then the Tory majority was able to turn that down. And essentially MPs were voting for MPs not to have a vote on trade deals, which is ironic and problematic. And against democracy. And unfortunately, that has gone through. We didn't get the outcome we wanted, but it was critically important that we campaigned on that, because now we can hold them to account. It's very clear what the public wanted. There were polls on it, there were campaigns on it, and yet the Tories went against that. So that will help us as we continue to campaign on those issues going down the line. So I think and I hope that we can defeat the bill. Regardless, we must continue to put the pressure on.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And now finally over to Chris on this one.
Well, I've been feeling a lot of despair and fear over the past, not just days and weeks, but months. And it is incredibly heartening to hear a bunch of very smart, dedicated people who do a lot more good than I do be so, not necessarily falsely positive, but determined to fight. And thank you. You've given me a lot of heart. I have the sad answer is I sort of do think it will be law, but that I definitely agree with everyone who is saying that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight. There are lots of other good outcomes that can come from really focusing a fight. I also think it will be perhaps a good thing to really focus our minds on unhooking ourselves from the assumption that we have to remain within the law to protest peacefully. And I think it will concentrate minds on, I mean, this is legislative fascism, so we have to concentrate our minds on, are the people who are our political opponents in danger of making themselves our enemies? And that is a really dangerous place to be. And that's one of the reasons I find it so frightening. I'd say over the past few months, I've found myself so radicalised that I frighten myself. And I live a very comfortable, middle-class, faux bohemian life of being a sort of artist type with no real job and no real fear. And yet I feel that kind of despairing and angry. What are the people who really have skin in the game feeling like? And so that frightens me as well. I think we will see a lot more direct action and some frightening direct action going forward. It's a strategically moronic bill as well, because if you, even from a non-partisan, just process point of view, the right to peaceful protest is an incredibly useful pressure valve, and it stops people overreacting for things, and it just does a lot for, like, I'm quite a cynic about the big organised, nice, peaceful protests where we go and shout no war at the Prime Minister and then we go out for pizza and then we all go home by 6. And in fact, one of the most heartening things about Extinction Rebellion is that they managed to bring large movements of people beyond that to the kind of slightly more scary, properly disruptive model, which I find exciting. And to think that they're removing the bit that is the safest for them by saying, oh, well, we're going to punish the very peaceful, nice, legal protesters really harshly as well. Well, you're just going to criminalise a load of us and people are going to get hurt, and that's how it's going to be. We have to focus on the media. The real dangerous thing at the moment is that we've got this culture of, you know it, I don't even need to say it, we've got an evil right-wing media owned by a cabal of tax-dodging bastards who are quite happy to fuck the country to enrich themselves and their mates, and we treat them like, oh, they're a bit annoying, but sometimes they're okay, and the progressive media is not much better. And that's where we need to focus as much of our activity as we can, is we need to change the media, which is why something like this is so amazing. It's the beginning of something. The vibrant scene of grassroots media that is springing up at the moment is perhaps part of the solution. Anyway, I'll stop because I don't know enough technical stuff to talk about it. But God, thank you for being more optimistic than I am.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to move us on to our next question in the interest of time, because we have 37 minutes left and 2 pretty big questions to go. But on Chris's final point there, and also I know that Billy and others mentioned it as well, I absolutely agree that we need to change the media, and Bright Green certainly is not owned by any tax-dodging bastards and is definitely not right-wing either. So if you have been enjoying this discussion, please do, if you're watching on Facebook, share the link, get more people watching it so that we can get these ideas and discussions out to more and more people. And similarly, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, comment down below. It helps us bump up the algorithm and gets more people watching. So we're going to move on to our next question now, and I'm going to ask panelists if they could start to shorten their answers so that we can squeeze in both of our final questions if possible. The last question always gets squeezed, I'm sorry. But our next question, I'm going to come to Sarah on first. It's in the context of what we're seeing across Europe at the moment, where I think it was reported just yesterday that French hospitals are being reported as being on the cusp of being overwhelmed by a third wave of COVID. So the question is, how do we in the UK avoid a third COVID wave? Over to Sarah.
What's eminently clear is that avoiding a third wave is not only about hospitals and it's not only about healthcare. So I think there are some principles that will apply across our public health response. And when I say public health, I mean the kind of response that we have across all sectors of society. And many of those principles will apply to healthcare as well. I work as a medical doctor, so I'm more familiar with what's happening within the health service itself. But I think that it's become increasingly clear to those of us on the front line that preventing a pandemic or mitigating the worst effects of a pandemic, the work of that is mainly done outside of hospitals. And actually COVID is a disease where there are relatively limited things that we can do in hospital. You know, there are drugs that can slightly decrease the chances of mortality, but and people can be supported, and you know, heroic work has been done by people in intensive care units and across healthcare. But the biggest influencing factors on how we're going to come out of the COVID situation and whether we're going to have a third wave and to what extent are very much within, are very much outside of the delivery of healthcare. So I think some of the key things that are really important are trust and engagement, equity and ensuring access, and ensuring the ability of people to make their own choices about health and healthcare, and just allowing people to do the right thing. So I think it's clear that trust has been lost in governance, and also there's been a risk of trust being broken within societies, and that is not conducive to people being able to make the right choices about how they behave during the pandemic, and whether we can mitigate against further transmissions. In terms of equity of access, of course, Keep Our NHS Public have been campaigning for many years to try to ensure that the health service remains a public service. And one of the key reasons for that is so that it's accessible to everybody, so that people aren't turned away dependent on, for example, their immigration status or their ability to pay. And the pandemic has been an opportunity for us to recognise the value of the NHS, which happened at the beginning, and then it's been taken as an opportunity by the government to slide in some deals where a number of services have been contracted out to private services, to private providers, which I think is really problematic, and the timing of that is really challenging. I'm currently working in microbiology services, and that makes me really aware that a lot of the things that are really important about delivery of healthcare are the things that we don't see. So the kind of back end things like making sure that we have good quality cleaning, or that we have good quality services to decide on who gets antibiotics and when. These sorts of things aren't exactly making it to the front pages of the media, but they're critical to the outcomes for patients that go into hospital. And these are the sorts of things that are getting kind of shelved off to private providers, and therefore possibly not being done as well, and puts us at great risk in the future. So in terms of trying to keep it short, I think some of the principles that we've already talked about governance, about democracy, and about supporting people to be able to do the right thing. So ensuring that people have an income and they don't have to leave a home to go to work if they test positive. We need to have a strategy that's about allowing people to avoid being contact with COVID-19 as individuals. If they do have contact, we need people to be as resilient as they're able to be. So we need to support everything from kind of education to nutrition and people being able to feed themselves, to financial income. And then we need to try to reduce the transmission in that way. And then when people access healthcare, we need to make sure they're not afraid to do that, and that it's at the highest quality that it can be through a publicly provided national health service. So we need a renationalisation of the NHS.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to bring Olivia in next. So under Keir Starmer's leadership, the Labour Party has received a fair amount of criticism that their position on the coronavirus response has been largely to support the government. So I guess the question I'd put to you in relation to this is, what do you think the Labour Party should be arguing for in terms of clear policy demands from the government to prevent a third wave of coronavirus?
So, you know, over the last year, I sit on a cross-party committee called the Public Accounts Committee, and we basically look at all government spending. And I have to say, we've done a lot of work looking at all the different things that have gone wrong in the last year around COVID. So, you know, we did a report on track and trace, which basically said it was a waste of money because it didn't do what its main kind of aim was, which was to prevent lockdowns. You know, I've been asking multiple questions over track and trace. You know, I'm probably one of the few MPs who's actually used a PCR machine, knows what PCR is. You know, I've got a background as a biomedical scientist, and I think that it's just kind of, it was very clear from the outset that we weren't talking to the right people. Government were trying to do something that without necessarily using all the skills that was available at its fingertips, both in the NHS but also in local authorities around public health in particular. And I think with the Labour Party, you would have had more of that. I think it's clear. We know that the best way into communities is with people in the communities. And I think, you know, that's something that's really, really clear. Very early on, I was calling for a national food service, and lo and behold, 2 weeks later, they were sending out parcels of food to people. You know, these are things that, like, I think Labour politicians have a greater understanding of. I think that the issue of food has been a huge one, which is why I've been campaigning for a right to food with Ian Byrne, because it's so important. But that this all comes down to the fact that we're even discussing having another wave comes down to purely the fact that we have in Sheffield the demographic who have been hit hardest are the low-paid working poor. The lowest paid workers in our city have been the biggest group hit in terms of cases and in terms of deaths. And the reason that is because of their insecurity in work. They've been forced to go to work because they don't have sick pay. They don't have statutory sick pay even. They don't have the economic security to withstand lockdowns. They have to go to work. There is no choice. And their jobs are less likely to be furloughed. And that's true for women as well. Women's jobs are more likely to be in that as well. So there is a gender element to this as well. So I think there's a huge question, and I think the Labour Party got that. And, you know, I think that we can say and learn a lot of lessons, but we need to learn them now, which is why I support an inquiry. But also I think that the work of committees like the one I am on is so important, because we're making those recommendations now. We looked at PPE. What an absolute mess. The only pandemic they'd planned for was a flu pandemic. And I'm sure Sarah will tell you, the stuff that you need for a flu pandemic is completely different from a coronavirus pandemic in terms of the protection that you need. And I think that's just really key. And I take the point that Sarah's making about the wider inequalities that lead to the big issues in our health system. And unfortunately, if you have poor health, like a lot of people in my city have, you are at greater risk. And, you know, I think there was a kind of the coronavirus is a great leveler at the beginning of this, and that's absolutely been seen to be not true. So I think for Labour, I think Labour would have done a lot of things differently if we were in power. I think the criticism we've had actually is for supporting one of the only things that seems to have slowed the virus, which is lockdown. And now I understand how frustrating lockdowns have been for people, but they clearly have worked in slowing the virus at crucial times. And actually, I think the mistakes that have been made are that they haven't happened early enough. And the decision-making process of this government is too slow. And I think that actually, when we look back at this, you'll see how much Labour politicians like myself have been holding the government to account on this, and will continue to.
Thanks, Olivia. So I'm going to come to Deborah next on this one. So how do we stop a third wave of COVID?
Thanks, because first I would just sort of agree with your statement that you made previously. I do think that the sort of leadership of the Labour Party hasn't been nowhere near strong enough. And I think one thing in terms of avoiding a third wave is that we need not just the Labour Party, but I guess everyone sort of, on the progressive side of society to stand up to this government and say very, 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 make, demands very clearly. We need sort of, the trade unions to do that as well. And I think that is very important. I know we haven't got very much time, so I'll just be really, really short what I think needs to happen. I think a socialist response to the pandemic starts with the adoption of a strategy to eliminate the virus. I think that has to be the goal. And we have to put people before profit at every opportunity and create sort of a genuine safety net for people, like a genuine social security system. And I think, we just need a combination of thorough and early lockdowns, learning from other countries. And yes, we might have to go into lockdown again, but if we do, it can't be a half-assed lockdown. It has to involve all workplaces that are not in any way key, and that can't operate from home, closing. We need effective tests and trace. We need financial support and security. And obviously we need to roll out the vaccines as sort of quickly as we possibly can. I think if we do all of those things, and the government generally listens, which we probably know they won't, but to the people who know how this society works, who keep the society running, then I think we could hopefully avoid a third wave of COVID, which I'm sure we all desperately want.
Thanks, Deborah. So I'm going to bring in Chris next on this one.
I'm really optimistic on this one. I don't think we'll have a third wave. Famous last words. I think that the vaccine rollout has been fantastic, and the work that the scientists and the medical experts have done is wonderful, even when the government is a bunch of incompetent, corrupt fools. And I feel very excited that we may get a spike in the number of cases as we open up, but I do not think we're going to see a third wave. And I think we're going to see that the various vaccines are remarkably effective, and then they increase in effectiveness as we go through the year and pretty soon we'll have more effective vaccines and so on. And I personally think we're going to be okay now. That's not to say it hasn't been a catastrophe, and I agree with everything that everyone said, but it slightly felt like everything everyone said was a panel of progressives in April. It didn't feel like, it doesn't, none of that's all happened now. We've killed 140,000 people. We've wrecked the economy. We've left millions unsupported. That's been done. But I don't think unless something really unexpected happens, I think that we're now in the final furlong. I just hope everyone listens to the scientists rather than government, and listens to the medical experts, and doesn't get too excited for rushing out and cuddling everybody, and just take it easy. That's my answer.
Thanks, Chris. So bringing Rosie on this next, do you share Chris's optimism there that we are not heading for a third wave?
I want to now. You solved me, Chris. That was. I don't really have so much to add. I think there's been some really great points made. If I'm honest, I know we're short of time, but I think that generally, like, as we move forward, any prevention scheme, obviously, like, we can learn so much from track and trace, and the fact that it just can't. No system can be handed over to private contractors, and we have to really focus on the fact that the vaccination programme rolled out predominantly by local healthcare professionals has been the thing that has worked here. And that's a principle that we must stick to and keep fighting for the public ownership of our NHS and supporting the work of Keep Our NHS Public and We Own It and so on. I think that kind of is the heart of this.
Great, thanks, Rosie. So finally, over to you, Billy, on this one. How do we stop a third wave of COVID? I think you're on mute again, Billy, sorry.
I'm reminded of what Sarah said about the solutions outside the hospitals. And, you know, most people well know this fact probably, but the biggest cure for disease in the last 200 years has been sewers, right? You say that to people, it's a good pub quiz question, by the way. The creation of a sewer system cured done so much for health. That's why in London at the moment, they're dealing with they're building a new super sewer, because, you know, it's a key part of preventing any kind of disease. And famously, the first John Snow, you know, found that how infection was spread through that watering hole in Soho. Anyone knows that little bit of your history? So that's the first thing. You know, these are social issues. In terms of how do we prevent another spike or whatever, I think put track and trace in the hands of local councils. They're the people on the ground who are closest to the problem. And it's, you know, we use the NHS to deliver the vaccine. Hey, guess what? It's a roaring success. So put the track and trace in the hands of local councils, because, you know, they do the collection of data for local elections and stuff like that. And it was only kind of blind prejudice that met the government, and a bit of corruption has to be said as well, that them track and trace. And the other thing I think, and I'll finish on this point, is learning from China, because one of the reasons why we don't hear so much of how well China has done is the xenophobia we have in this country at the moment on all things Chinese. Chinese done brilliantly in tackling the outbreak. And similarly with South Korea, similarly with New Zealand, and some of the other countries around that part of the world. And why was that? Because they had the experience of SARS. And I'm not completely clear about what happened with SARS in the UK, but they had the experience of SARS, and they made sure, you know, my nephew and his wife work in South Korea, and they used to tell me how quick they were on the case. Whereas, and let's not forget that Johnson and Dominic Cumming and all the rest of them, they were for herd immunity very early on, and there's evidence of that. So put track and trace in the hands of local councils, learn from other countries internationally, China, Korea, and New Zealand and the like. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy, and thanks to all of our panel. We have just 18 minutes left, so I am going to move us swiftly on to our final question. And it's a question that I'm sure will be debated for hours and hours and weeks to come. But we're going to try and get through some strong and insightful responses to it in our remaining 18 minutes together. So our final question for this evening, and I'm going to ask panelists to, if they can, take no longer than 2 minutes on this one, which I know is an impossible task. But the question I'm going to put to Deborah first is, does the left have a future in the Labour Party?
I'm waiting all evening to debate this question because I'm hoping, you know, we potentially have different views. So as I'm here representing Momentum, the biggest socialist organisation in this country, in the Labour Party, sorry, it's going to come as no surprise that I obviously believe that the left does have a future in the Labour Party. And I just want to like start really briefly, and this might take slightly longer than 2 minutes, I'm sorry, but by talking about my own political trajectory, because I definitely haven't always been a member of the Labour Party. I sort of got politicised at university. I think Chris and me actually basically met then in the sort of student movement, and was very active in the extra parliamentary left, and didn't really see Parliament as a side of struggle that I wanted to engage in. And was then, you know, after Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, I was convinced, after it took a year or so, I was sort of convinced that to join the Labour Party and become active in it. And the thing I was convinced of was not that Corbyn was a nice man, or that the Labour Party was great, but the thing that I was then convinced of was that we, in order to win transformative change in this country at this moment in time, we had to fight in Parliament as well as outside of it. It wasn't enough to just build the movements outside. We also had to be active in Parliament, and that the Labour Party was the only way to do that. And so I joined the party and obviously have sort of been very active. And I think basically that sort of strategic question that we have to aim to take over the state, I think that hasn't changed no matter who's running the Labour Party. So that would be my first point. And it's not, I know for a lot of people, I do understand why some people might not want to be active in it anymore, but it's not a moral question for me. It's a strategic question. The Labour Party has got the historic links to the trade unions, and it still does. It is by far, the left within the party is by far the biggest sort of force, and not, you know, much bigger than other political parties such as the Greens. And I just don't think under first past the post, it is an effective strategy to try and build something new. But I think the important thing is we shouldn't just be active in the Labour Party. That shouldn't be the only thing we're doing. It wasn't enough during the Corbyn years, and it definitely isn't enough now. And at Momentum, we have just released a sort of strategy for the next 3 years, so 2021 to 2024, that recognises exactly that, which is that, you know, the sort of stark reminder that the election defeat in 2019 gave us, that, you know, there's no shortcut to socialism. And we definitely strongly believe that every Momentum member and every sort of left, you know, activist out there, we all have to commit ourselves to the long-term work of movement building inside and outside the party. And we have to think long-term and strategic. You know, the time of jumping from leadership election to election, general election, is over. And I think that means that we can have some breathing space and really focus on that sort of long-term, laying the foundations for socialist change. And that's sort of what we're doing at Momentum. And, you know, we're seeing it as 3 sort of key areas: needing to build left power in the Labour Party and electing socialists in the party, campaigning for them, campaigning in communities and supporting working class struggle, and finally popularising socialist ideas and politically educating in society. That's sort of what I guess we see as our mission now. And I think, you know, if anyone watching this, if you need a socialist home inside the party, then you should join Momentum and sort of become active in your local group. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing what others have to say and maybe coming back.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm going to bring in Billy next. So obviously you are a former general secretary of one of the more left-wing trade unions. What do you see as the future of the left in the Labour Party?
We're not going away, that's for sure. It's the first thing. We're going to be here for a long time, certainly. If I said to you, what city in England was the Tory jewel in the crown? What you mean? You probably guessed the answer. Me asking the question with my accent. But what city was the Tory jewel in the crown? What city had more Irish nationalists on the council than Labour Party? What city had an Irish nationalist MP up to 1931? And what city was the last city to go Labour in 1955? If I said that city was Liverpool, you'd be surprised, I think. And if I said to you, when I joined what is now the CWU, it was one of the most right-wing unions in the country. Would you be surprised? I never wanted to get involved in the union because it was so right-wing. But I decided, well, you know, somebody said, but you never go to union meetings and so on and so on. And I sometimes think doing politics is a bit like doing drugs. Not that I advocate doing drugs because we're on Facebook and all the rest of it, but it's been reported to me. You start with a spliff and you think, oh, I'll just go to a few branch meetings. I'm not going to do anything. And then someone says to you, but do you want to try this stronger stuff? It's called being a representative. And you go, oh, I'm not sure about that. And then before you know where you are, before I knew where I was mainlining national officer representing 150,000 postal workers and then a general secretary. So, of course, times get tough and times are bad if you're on the left. But being on the left in and of itself is a problem. You know, they used to say that the Queen thinks the world smelled of fresh paint. You know, the story that the Queen, because everywhere she went, there was the smell of fresh paint. And, you know, we've all got family and friends. And if you're an activist, you must have had the experience where someone goes, oh, better not say anything, someone's coming here now. And you have that curious light, you have that curious world where, you know, and this is a danger on the left. You end up talking with, you know, with only people that agree with you. But Robert Owens wrote the famous book, which I don't think is a particularly great book, but it's a seminal book called The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist. And in it, which I put on my own Facebook a couple of days ago, the actual quote, people think we're a little bit mad on the left. You know, these are, you know, obviously the government's right and stuff like that. But my experience of politics is, of course, the left's got a future inside the party. Does that mean, as Deborah says, that's our only area of activity? Of course not. You know, I'm able to chew gum and walk at the same time. You know, there's other areas of act. Now, that doesn't say that those people who seek not to be involved in the party, we write them off. I mean, because of our electoral system in this country, and I'm a supporter of proportional representation, it's an outrage that 800,000 people who vote Green in this country have one MP. It's an absolute outrage. And you need fewer, it takes fewer votes to get a Tory MP than it does a Labour MP, and even fewer for a Scottish Nationalist MP. So we have a broken democracy. And one of the things the establishment has never got over in this country is, in some ways, the Enlightenment even has never got over the idea that every one of us should have equal rights. You know, we still got a country that we share with LISO, that you get into the chamber that legislates on the basis of who your dad was. 92 people, it's 87 because there's a few vacancies. 87 people sit in the Lords because of who their dad had slept with. And that's the only reason. And guess what? They're all men and they're all white. And when there's a by-election, do you know women can't stand in them by-elections? That's our democracy at the moment, where we have, I think it's called protogenitory or something, isn't it? Where we stopped, where the Queen's family, the women in the Queen's family after 2011 can be heirs to the throne. In the House of Lords, in this so-called mother of all parliaments, we have 87 people who are there. And if they have to replace them and they fill these by-elections, that they can only be men. And 49% of them went to Eton. So I think there's a tremendous future for the left. At the moment, we're going through a bit of a low period, shall I say, in terms of it. But, you know, I'm a great believer in it. If you know, sometimes you're not even sure yourself, you know, whether your activity is going to make a difference. And I've been in so many disputes over the years. Don't say that as a boast. Well, I didn't think I was going to win. I think the left will be back. Why do I think they'll be back in greater? Not because what we say makes sense. And I think capitalism is a form of selfishness and a form of immaturity that says the way I look after everybody else is just being selfish. Well, as we've seen through COVID, the values of caring for each other and everyone is what makes our society tick. Sorry, it's a bit of a rant, but that's my contribution.
Thanks, Billy. I was just about to cut you off there, so thanks for wrapping up. So we have 7 minutes left and 4 people to get through. So if possible, be as quick as possible. I'm going to come to Chris on this one next. What is the future of the left of the Labour Party?
I don't really care. I don't have any interest in the Labour Party. That's my answer.
That was much briefer than I was expecting. So I'm going to bring in another person who perhaps has less interest or less skin in the game, at least in the Labour Party. I'm going to come to Rosie next. So obviously you're co-chair of the Young Greens, involved with the Green Party. What do you see in terms of a future for the left in the Labour Party?
Thanks so much. And I think I'll start actually with agreeing with Deborah on the point of movement building inside and outside of political parties. And I think fascinatingly, when we did see the kind of surge of activism and energy pour into the Labour Party, we did also see a vacuum on the other side within various movements from the student movement beyond. And that has been a real loss. And I think those institutions that we needed to keep building, that infrastructure, those movements, now need to happen again. And I'm hoping that we do see that as one of the impacts of the kind of huge kind of loss of left-wing activists in the Labour Party. And I'm afraid that I think really in reality, after even seeing that huge surge of really exciting energy under the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, the reality right now is that the new Labour leadership clearly is abandoning any particularly left-leaning vision for the Labour Party, in my opinion. And we've seen this in regard to Starmer's position on the policing bill very recently, only being kind of forced to U-turn. We've seen it in regard to nursing pay, still not being willing to back the unions and back the call for a 15% pay rise. And the result has been real disenchantment amongst people I know on the left in the movement, and lots of people really leaving, and not just activists and volunteers, but also candidates, people who could have potentially been very exciting progressive candidates. And ahead of the kind of local elections in May, I think the reality is that when you want to put your cross on that ballot paper for a socialist left-leaning candidate, that is not going to be, you're not going to get that from the Labour Party this year round, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Rosie. So before I come to Olivia to have the last word, I'm going to bring in Sarah on this one. So what is the future of the left of the Labour Party, Sarah?
We're running out of time, and the fact is we need there to be a future for the left in terms of the environment and the threat of climate change, which has perhaps been the elephant in this debate. So I thought it might come up in relation to what we need to do to prevent a third wave, because many of the things that we need to do to kind of save ourselves and save people's lives from this short-term threat of COVID, we also need to do to protect our society from the kind of environmental destruction that we've been wreaking over the last few years. And we need the left to lead in that, because an unequal society led by neoliberalism, while we've had lots of positive innovations that have supported sustainability through that model of kind of competition and growth and greed, there've been good innovations. Ultimately, we're living well beyond our means. And in terms of getting to within our means, we need a strong left. And so I agree with the comment in the chat that we need a progressive alliance. I agree we absolutely need electoral reform, and we need all this to happen really quickly. So I think there is a future in the Labour Party. To what extent that will be the force that allows us to get through this, and get through this in a positive way that doesn't only leave the people who are already the most vulnerable further vulnerable and further affected by these kind of negative potential future impacts. I don't know, but I think we do need to be working across every strategy that we can, both to promote a fairer society and also to address the environmental concerns that we are all too ready to ignore when we have things like COVID on the horizon. So I hope there's a strong future for the left in the Labour Party.
Thanks, Sarah. And finally, on this question, I'm going to bring in Olivia. Olivia, obviously, you're a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs. The Socialist Campaign Group of MPs is larger now than it was before the last general election. But it seems, at least from an outsider's perspective, that the influence the Socialist Campaign Group is having on the direction of the Labour Party is diminished. Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the left's, where do you see the left's position at the moment in relation to the rest of the Labour Party, and what do you see as the left's future in the party?
Well, I'm pretty confident about the left's future in the party, partly because of the great colleagues I've been elected with in the 2019 intake. There's some fantastic people there, and definitely ones to watch for the future. I think I've been reflecting on this quite a lot, and I think Billy's absolutely right. Politics changes over time. It always has, it always will. 1987, Irving Patnick representing my seat. 1997, it was Richard Allen. 2017, it was won by Labour for the first ever time. So, you know, clearly things can change, and I don't necessarily agree that this kind of core vote and voter segmentation kind of approach to looking at how to win people over is necessarily the right one. I think, you know, in Sheffield Hallam, we won because we built a coalition of people around our ideas. And the reason we did that is because our ideas are the only ones that answer the questions that we're all facing today. I think that is absolutely true. I think, you know, whether it's the Green New Deal, the transformative manifestos that we've had, the core principles about some of the challenges we're going to be facing, they all resounded with my electorate, and that's why I'm here today, rather than Irving Patnick or Richard Allen, successor of their parties. You know, it's absolutely clear people are sick to the back teeth and want change. Unfortunately, I don't think that message was heard universally in 2019, and I think that there's many reasons for that. So I think that, you know, we do have to dust ourselves off a bit and get back out there with our ideas. Our ideas are absolutely the core of what we believe in. That's what makes the left in the Labour Party different from other elements of the Labour Party, is our ability to think differently, look and criticise and critique the society we live in and come up with solutions. It's always been the most exciting part of the party for me because of that. But I'm certainly someone, and, you know, even though I am in the SCG, I recognise the value of having a Labour Party which is broader than just the left. I think it's really important. You know, we haven't spoken about cooperatives, but we could have easily spoken about cooperatives in the discussion we were having on arts. We could have easily spoken about much more about trade union rights and that element of the party, which isn't universally left-wing, as we know, but does have more left tendencies, which I think is a positive thing for the Labour Party too, and something that absolutely needs to be strengthened. I once said that, you know, trade unions are our movement, and what I meant by that is, you know, there is no Labour Party without the trade union movement within it. That's absolutely true for the left as well. So I think it's about how we make our core arguments the only answer on the table to some of the questions that we've got. And I think we've seen that in the past, and we can definitely see that in the future. And that might mean that some of us have to put our egos to one side, but we need to. And at the end of the day, we only have one planet. The clock is ticking, and the future is there to be ours, and we need to work together as much as possible to achieve that in the Labour Party. But I absolutely believe that we have the answers, and we can organise to deliver them if we're given the opportunity.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to all of our panel. We are 2 minutes over. I apologise for keeping you all longer than I promised. But that is unfortunately all we've got time for this evening. So once again, a huge thank you to our incredible panel. I have found the things that they have said incredibly insightful, enlightening, and engaging, and I hope all of our audience has done too. I'd also like to thank our audience, whether you're watching us on Zoom, whether you've been sticking the whole way through on Facebook, or whether you are leisurely watching back on YouTube. I hope you've enjoyed this debate as well. If you are watching on Facebook, it's not too late to share that link. People will still see the video. More people will be watching it. And of course, if you're watching at YouTube, hit subscribe and you will never miss anything that we release. Before I say goodbye to you all this evening, I've got some final little bits of housekeeping and a few things to plug. All of the links that I'm going to be talking about will be in the chat on Zoom, will be in the comments on Facebook, and will be in the description of the YouTube video. But just very, very quickly, I just wanted to say a few final things. The first thing is that this event is only made possible by the kind support of our generous donors. If you are able to donate to Bright Green, please do. We are not funded by billionaires, or as Chris said earlier, tax dodging bastards. We are funded by good, honest people giving a very, very small amount each month. So if you can donate, please do donate. We can put on more events like this. We can run more articles. We can grow and grow and grow. The second thing I wanted to say is that this is a fortnightly event series. The next of them is taking place in 2 weeks' time on April the 13th. On that debate, we will be joined by Claire Bailey, who is the leader of the Green Party in Northern Ireland. We'll be joined by Bob Gill, who's the director of the Great NHS Heist. We'll be joined by John Bosco Nwobo from We Own It, and Anna Oppenheim from Momentum's National Coordinating Group. So don't miss that. The link is there wherever you're watching. And the final thing I just wanted to say was that you can follow us on all the social media channels, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, and never miss anything we do. I think that is all I have to plug. So thank you once again to our incredible panel. Thank you to everyone for watching, and I hope you all have wonderful rest of your Tuesday evenings. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Bright Green Debates.